Hi, this is Emma Sutherland. Join us on FX Medicine next week, where I'll be talking to paediatric naturopath Keone Moore about neurodevelopmental conditions in children. Subscribe to us on your favourite podcast app and follow us on social media to make sure you never miss an episode.
Hi, and welcome to FX Medicine by BioCeuticals, where we bring you the latest in evidence-based, integrative, functional, and complementary medicine. FX Medicine acknowledges the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia, where we live and work, and their connections to land, sea, and community. We pay our respect to their elders, past and present, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples today. Joining us on the line today is Dr. Greg Kelly, a naturopathic physician and author of the book Shape Shift. Greg was the editor of the Journal of Alternative Medicine Review and has been an instructor at the University of Bridgeport in the College of Naturopathic Medicine. Dr. Greg has published hundreds of articles on natural medicine and nutrition, contributed to the textbook of natural medicine, and has more than 30 journal articles indexed on PubMed. His areas of expertise include nootropics, anti-aging, sleep, and the chronobiology of performance and health. Welcome to FX Medicine by BioCeuticals, Greg. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thanks for having me on your podcast.
Oh, we're so excited to talk to you today about nootropics. So the term nootropic was first used in the 1970s to describe substances that primarily activate our cognitive functions and enhance memory and learning. But we're really seeing this growing interest in them in the last few years. Can you tell us more about nootropics, Greg, in terms of what the characteristics are for a nootropic to have to be classified as such?
Yeah, I think if you don't mind, maybe like a quick history lesson. So the term was coined by a Romanian psychologist and chemist that at one point, and it was sometime in the late 1950s to early 1960s, he was trying to make a GABA analog, and specifically for sleep, and synthesize something called piracetam, which was the first in a group of compounds called racetams today. And what he noticed is it didn't work to affect sleep in the animals, but it helped with their learning and their behavior. In a sense, it made them appear smarter. And so he eventually coined the term nootropic to describe things in this category that piracetam fit in. And his original way of classification had to do with these things being active in the central nervous system. So they were things that targeted the brain. They impacted learning and memory in positive ways. They also could do things where they would make us more resistant to typically things that would disrupt or impair learning. So think, like toxic chemicals and stress and things like that. He also thought they had a lot to do with facilitating what he referred to as interhemispheric transfer of information. But just think of, a big part of the brain is getting information from one part to another, often done through like brain waves and things like that. So what he thought of as the higher functioning parts of our brain, which we can get more into those, but those would often be things like our ability to manage our emotions and executive functions and things like that. And then the other thing he felt strongly about was that these things should be virtually non-toxic. So that was the original definition fit into there. It's been broadened a little bit over the years, and I think the movie Limitless put a lot of, like nootropics on the map here, at least in the U.S. But really, colloquially, I think of them more in the context of their things that people take most commonly to feel more energy, to have more focus, to have better memory, and often to get more things done, like that motivation piece. And so, when I think of, all his original criteria, I still believe are really important, but those four things are the main use case. And what I often refer to the big three is mental energy, focus, and motivation. So the vast majority of people that pioneered nootropics and that take them, or took them historically, whether it was the Silicon Valley types or university students. It was for those reasons.
So coming back to those concepts of mental energy, focus and motivation, a lot of people, a lot of clients, when they come to see me, it's something they tick on their intake form, that they're struggling with ability to concentrate and focus and be motivated to do all the things. And certainly I think, wow, I'm the queen of procrastination at times too. Why do we get depleted, I guess, in terms of mental energy, and why is it so important?
So the way neuroscientists tend to think about it is that we would almost have like a cognitive resource tank, or like, a bucket of cognitive resources that we would start each day with. And then over the course of the day, we're going to be constantly drawing from that. And if we're doing things that our brain is used to doing, we probably won't be drawing a lot of resources. But anytime we need to do demanding things or new things, then we draw a lot more. And even on a normal day, what often happens towards the middle of the afternoon is we've used up a lot of those resources. And so often we hit a wall of sorts, right, where our focus isn't where we would like it to be, or, maybe our mood, our ability to self-manage that is suffering. Things like motivation, goal setting, those are part of those executive functions, right? So those often suffer. And so I think a lot of it has to do with resource depletion. Another big part is just efficiency. I think, nutrition, sleep, stress, all the, common things I think that you would coach the people you work with about healthy diet and lifestyle. Those things, when they're not in place, our brain tends to just run less efficiently. So the resources it starts the day with aren't going to go anywhere near as far, and the energetics of the brain might be really disrupted. There's like the brain in a general sense consumes, usually the estimate's about 20% of our calories go to running the brain as ATP. And glucose is usually thought of as the preferred fuel for the brain, but some brains, especially as we get older, so dementia, Alzheimer's as an example, but a lot of people with, either mood issues or you get into the really severe brain things like schizophrenia, their brains tend to, for some reason, be energetically poor at using glucose and do a lot better with ketones, as an example. So the brain energetics comes into play a lot and is a big part. If we were to go back to that chemist that originally discovered or created piracetam, when he was asked how it worked, his original thought was that it had to do with ATP and improving ATP in the brain. So a lot of issues with the brain really do boil down to energetics.
So if in terms of those energetics and the resource depletion, what about for students and practitioners that might be getting enough sleep and generally eating well? What other things could contribute to that resource depletion?
Well, it's just like our modern world is not designed to optimize our ability to focus. And even in a more pristine environment, sustaining attention over time is cognitively demanding. Anytime there's a kind of a model of system 1 and system 2 when it comes to the brain, and think of those as characters, and it's Daniel Kahneman. Thinking Fast and Slow is the book that he introduced these characters. But the idea behind it was we have certain things that require our brain to invest more energy and work. And he called those jobs system 2 jobs. But those are, like focusing and sustaining our focus and avoiding distraction and goal setting and being motivated and things like that. Those just require a bigger investment of resources and energy by the brain. And then the system 1 character was, the one that showed up whenever those things were not as available or the resources were short. And those are like, think of zoning out or, being distracted by our environment. So there's always this push-pull between these two characters, System 1 and System 2. The world has just got so that, there's many more demands on our attention than there would have been. So for listeners, I'm in my early 60s. There's a lot more demands on people my nephew and niece's age than there were on my ability to focus when I was their age, with smartphones and with social media and all these things that are constantly vying for this limited pool of attentional resources.
Yeah, I really resonate with that. I was thinking about last night when I was trying to write a presentation, and I noticed myself. I went to start writing, and then I was checking my emails, and then I was looking at my phone, and I thought, what is going on? I have this inability to focus, and I'm missing these small details. And it very much sounds like that maybe resource depletion that you were discussing, and I guess all the distractions too.
Yeah, there used to be. I remember when I was in naturopathic school, because that's my background, and being taught at the time that over the course of, say, an hour, that generally our attention would be heightened at the beginning of a lecture and at the end, and then be all over the place in between, with some points of like being completely inattentive, some being focused again. So that would be normal. But I interviewed for our podcast at one point a neuroscientist that's done a lot of work at Microsoft, and specifically on attention span. And I want to say she said the average employee of all the ones she had in her study checked email about 75 times a day.
Wow.
And why? Yeah, it's crazy, right? And that was the average. And why that's important, it's sometimes I think referred to as attentional residue. The general idea is that anytime our attention gets pulled off something, there's a residue before we can start to do focused work again. And, 5-10 minutes. And so the modern world, there's just a lot of things vying for our attention. And every time it gets diverted, it takes a bit of time to get back in a more of a flow state and be productive again. So, I know on my phone, there's very few things that are allowed to give me notifications. So, because I don't want distractions.
Yes, I think I need to take a leaf out of your book. So maybe this is a good time for us to start discussing what we can do in terms of helping us to focus and stop procrastinating and learn better. Let's start talking about the latest research behind some of these common nootropics that are available to us. And why don't we start with one of my favourites, which is L-theanine.
Yeah, L-theanine is great. So L-theanine is something that naturally occurs in green tea, as an example, but nowhere near as much in that as you'd have in a dietary supplement or used in studies. And the way I think of L-theanine simply is calm energy or calm focus, right? It's something that does, so maybe just stepping back, I tend to think of like how the brain works a bit like a pyramid. And that base of the pyramid we need to get higher up. And the base is alertness, so like being awake and alert, right? Everything else that we need is, requires that to happen. And then above that on the pyramid is what neuroscientists would call complex attention. So that's our ability to, get focus, sustain our focus, multitask when needed, though our brain's awful at multitasking in truth, and processing speed. All those would be part of that attention. And then above that, you get into things like executive functions, and social cognition would be another area. And then learning and memory evolves from that, right? If we weren't focused, we probably didn't learn and aren't going to remember. And so where L-theanine really shines is those bottom layers of the pyramid. It's one of the better ingredients for especially that attention layer of the pyramid. If we're already suffering from lack of alertness, like sleep deprivation, it's probably not going to be the best solution then. But that's why it's often layered together with caffeine, because then you have those two layers of the pyramid covered.
Yeah, yes. I have used it a lot myself before doing presentations. And what I typically tend to do is I love the caffeine, so I tend to drink a couple of coffees, and then I'm always regretting that I've drunk so much because I feel my heart starting to beat a bit faster. And then when I take the L-theanine, it does, I know that it improves that alpha wave activity. So it's helping you still be active but relaxed. And I remember reading in the study, it's very interesting, people feel less stressed, but it doesn't seem to have any effects on cortisol, which is interesting.
Yeah, it's more, I would think, of the nervous system and brain waves that it's impacting in terms of making people feel subjectively less stressed. It's also something that shows up pretty well repeatedly in studies for sleep properties.
At that higher dose, right?
Yeah.
So I was reading a really interesting study where it was given to healthy men and women, and I always think these studies are quite interesting in the healthy environment rather than, maybe individuals that already have cognitive deficits. And it was shown to improve a verbal fluency and the executive function, as you mentioned. And I think the verbal fluency is a really interesting when you look at these tasks that they make people do. It describes a task where they're having to name words that begin with a particular letter. So Greg, can you name every word you can think of beginning with the letter C for the next minute? And the individuals in the L-theanine group were able to come up with more fluently. So this could be useful, I guess, also for students as well as not the people that have dementia and so on.
Yeah, it's I think like L-theanine is interesting to me because it's well known in the nootropic community and has a lot of research in diverse areas, but it's probably still not wide. Like if I asked my siblings who aren't really much into my world, they would have no idea what L-theanine is or, could do to benefit them. So yeah, but what I think really where it shines most, and often what will happen is for listeners, when cognitive studies are done, quite commonly they'll do a battery of objective cognitive tests. Stroop test would be the name of one. But what these things are doing is they're looking at things like processing speed, ability to avoid distractions, not make errors, respond quickly. And different cognitive tests in that battery would then be used to essentially assign like this did well for visual memory, or this did well for auditory memory, or this did well for complex attention or processing speed. And where I really think theanine has repeatedly shined the most is things to do in that attention bucket, and even a bit with processing speed, because often if we can be more attentive, then we naturally respond a bit quicker to stimuli that would be used in these types of cognitive assessments.
Fantastic. Now, let's start talking about herbs, I guess. What about Bacopa, which has been used in Ayurvedic medicine for centuries for improving memory and intellect?
Yeah, so I think the two areas where Bacopa shines the most, and I'm going to put these in the order of my experience with it. The first would be more with mood, especially inducing a calmer mood. And why that can be important in a nootropic is that, and for listeners, this oversimplifies it, but often the impediment to being focused falls into one of two categories. In category one, it's almost like, think of your classic attention deficit. Like there's a lack of motivation. There's a lack of alertness. Like you don't have that oomph to become focused. You need something to kind of move you in that direction. And then there's another category that can impair focus where it's almost like the brain is too frantic.
Yes.
There's so much already going on that it's competing to get focused. And Bacopa would be really useful more in the latter than the former, if that makes sense.
I guess from naturopathically, we think of it as, apart from its nootropic action, it's nervine and anxiolytic. So is that where that's coming into play there?
Yes, that would be how I would think about it. So it would be, something that I think of, always, if I was going to do something more as a combination product or an herb for anxiety, Bacopa would be on the short list of things that I would have a lot of confidence in. And then its other big, category of benefit nootropically is memory, which, takes time, right? Memory, L-theanine for focus and, caffeine for alertness. Those are things that would show up in a single day, like a single dose and doing a study. But memory is something that takes time. And so what you would often see with Bacopa studies is that it takes, time to really shine as a nootropic. So, 4 weeks to 8 weeks, I think of as the minimum window. I would want someone to take Bacopa to see if it's really working for them as a nootropic.
Yeah, I love Bacopa. And you're right, the research does say, 4, 6 weeks, 12 weeks. But I don't know, this is a novelty for me because when I take Bacopa, I can literally take one tablet and I always say to my students, maybe an hour later, all these different words are being unlocked from my mind and I think, I didn't know I knew that word. It's really crazy that the way that Bacopa does that, whereas I take Saffron regularly and it's great as a nootropic too, but it doesn't seem to do that. So I'm wondering, I'm not sure why that is. In terms of the mechanism of action of Bacopa, it's pretty amazing, isn't it? I've read that the Bacopicides repair neurons. I've read it increases brain-derived neurotrophic factor. It's an antioxidant to the brain.
Yeah, it also has, I think of it as something that works more in the cholinergic, like the acetylcholine system, which is involved in neuroplasticity, learning, memory. There's an idea within neuroscience. I usually use the word relevance, but I'm sure you've run across as people will say, Greg, I don't remember names as well, or I'm struggling remembering this. And the way our brain, especially the more life experience we have, determines whether something should be remembered is whether it thinks it's relevant or not. So, if you or I right now moved to Japan, didn't know any Japanese, being surrounded with that language, really quickly our brain would get, this is relevant. I better put resources into this. And we would get better at Japan almost no matter our Japanese, almost no matter what we did. But conversely, when I was a teenager, I was an avid reader, but I hadn't read a lot of books. And I would read a book and I would remember the details of it really well. Where now I probably average about 50 books a year. And so I've taught my brain that each new set of characters it makes aren't particularly relevant because we're going to be moving on to new characters next week. So there would be no reason for it to put resources into remembering much of the details of books now. And so that idea of relevance. And one of the reasons I brought that up is that cholinergic system is part of what allows our brain to say, okay, this thing is happening and it's relevant. And acetylcholine is then the resource it uses to mark that relevance.
And that's I think that's how Saffron works too. I know we'll talk about it in a minute, but from my reading, that's how it works too. It works on that, reducing that acetylcholine breakdown. In terms of coming back to Bacopa, in terms of who you wouldn't give it to, is there a particular kind of patient that maybe you'd go, this isn't the right one? Because I'm just thinking about this yesterday, students were saying to me, how do I know which nootropic to give to which person? Is there a particular category of person you maybe wouldn't give Bacopa to?
So it would be someone that was already struggling with that first category, the lack of drive, like not feeling as feeling more lethargic. I would at least be more cautious with things like ashwagandha or Bacopa with them, because they can almost be too relaxing for someone that's already struggling with getting that oomph. So it doesn't mean they will be, but it wouldn't be my starting place with someone with ADHD. As an example. And I know in Reddit, sometimes you'll see with ashwagandha, as an example, people will describe it over time as being almost like kryptonite for their motivation. It dampened that down too much. And Bacopa, I think of as being similar in what it can do. It's just maybe not as common that I would see that as with ashwagandha.
Yeah. Okay. So coming back to my favorite Saffron, which always has me frothing because it's such an amazing herb and just fantastic for mood, but really, really good for memory and cognition, which I think a lot of people don't know about. But there's so much research coming out with it regarding Alzheimer's and other types of dementia. How does saffron seem to work in terms of its nootropic action?
I think it's got quite a bit of diverse. So like many things, like brain protection, neuroprotection, oxidative stress is definitely part of it. It's also anti-inflammatory, which again, many things with pigments like that are. And that's important because inflammation often underpins, just like I mentioned, energy is a driving. Inflammation tends to, often contribute to poor things our brain does, whether it's mood issues or issues with aging and so it does that. But then some of it's, it definitely works on the serotonin system, but it spins into a lot of systems. I've seen, and usually for listeners, the way that, these mechanistic things are often explored is in animal studies. But any of the monoamines, so dopamine, norepinephrine, serotonin, are all, those signaling systems are all impacted by saffron, and usually to do with reuptake of those neurotransmitters. There's something called NMDA. It works there. It interacts with the GABA system. So it really does interact with a lot of our different neurotransmitters.
Yeah. I was reading a study which showed that it's been shown to possess a moderate inhibitory activity, approximately 30% on the acetylcholine enzyme, which is, I think, the enzyme that usually breaks down acetylcholine. So saffron seems to inhibit that breakdown, which I guess is you were talking about before, the acetylcholine as being incredibly important for memory, learning and attention, which I thought was so interesting.
Yeah, and things that inhibit that enzyme, acetylcholinase inhibitors, are things that have long been used or at least researched more for brain aging. Like this would just be a generality. It's not always going to be true, but older brains struggle a lot more with acetylcholine signaling than younger, healthier brains.
Okay, that's very interesting. So then maybe that could be one reason why, for example, someone like me who gets a lot of benefit from Bacopa in terms of being able to instantly feel like there's differences with memory and retention, whereas I take saffron and I don't necessarily feel that because they're both working maybe a little bit differently and my brain's a bit younger.
Yeah, there's I don't know if they would have this in Australia, but in the U.S. nootropic community, you'll often hear your mileage may vary, YMMV, and the idea is that with many nootropics, you have to do that self-experimentation, because I think it's, as an example, do you know what the term aphantasia means?
No.
So are you visual? Like, if I said picture of flower, would you be able to really have a clear picture of a flower in your mind's eye?
Yes.
Yeah, so people with aphantasia don't create any pictures.
Oh.
At all. Like their brain doesn't do that. And then it's a relatively newish thing that's been studied, and so there's no certainty how many people have aphantasia, but it's thought to be 1% to 3%. But people's brains just don't make pictures. Most of us will have some kind of internal dialogue that goes on, but there's 1% to 3% of people that don't do that. So the key thing is all of our brains are different, and so what would be normal for my brain, if all of a sudden I was transplanted into your brain, it would probably be more like a psychedelic experience. I wouldn't be able to interpret things. And so because of that, we can talk about these mechanisms, and ashwagandha does this and Bacopa does that. Our brains are all somewhat unique. So at the end of the day, we all have to do our own self-experimentation. And what, like Bacopa does for your brain, may happen to us, a lot of other people's brains, but maybe not, maybe a really small subset.
I'm still spitting out that you said that some people have no internal dialogue happening. I can't imagine not having my little voices telling me all sorts of things. Wow.
Yeah, we just assume, or I would have, that everyone's brain does the same things mine does, and that's like just not true. Like I would be one of those people that have aphantasia. So I remember years and years ago, doing sitting in something and they were doing guided imagery and just thinking they're like, well, this is a waste of time. Like really? Like people are seeing things in their heads, and it never occurred to me that they actually were seeing things since I don't.
Wow, amazing. Okay, so that maybe is a good place to talk about Gingko, because I was reading some studies around Gingko, and one of the research papers I looked at was looking at they got the people in the study to say the colour of a word and not what the word says. So, for example, if you imagine that I have the word red written in front of me, but it's written in the colour blue, they were then asked, what is the word? And instead of writing or saying the red word, they should say blue as the correct answer. So I know that sounds confusing. It's probably easier if you were visually seeing it, but it's known as the word colour naming test, and it's involved with improving speed of processing and things like that. So Gingko was shown to improve processing speed, which I think is useful if you have to read something, if you feel like me and you have to read something 40 times before it actually sinks in. What's your kind of experience with Gingko as a nootropic?
Yeah, well, first we'll just touch on that test you described. So what that test is doing is requiring a couple different brain skills to execute that. One is attention, so we have to be paying attention. But one is an executive function, and it would be more disinhibition, right? Stopping ourselves before we make an error like that, like being, fast but correct in a sense, right? And so where I think of Gingko, like first and foremost, neuroprotection, lots of studies on that. It's also something that consistently blood flow and circulation to the brain, which is really important, right? To get, one of the reasons that often, like even in say an hour, our focus will ebb and flow is because we're using one part of our brain disproportionately, and it's kind of running short of resources. And then, resources from somewhere else in the brain or the body have to then get there to be replenished. And circulation, blood flow, is what helps with that. So Ginkgo is also important for that. And then, it's had quite a bit of research around memory. But as I mentioned earlier, we can only get to memory if we, had all the bases of the pyramid covered, right? Like the alertness, the attention. So yeah, Ginkgo kind of ripples its way up and is a fantastic herb. That said, there's a few animal studies that indicate it and Bacopa may somewhat cancel each other out.
Wow.
So, often it's assumed that, this does this and this does that. And if I do two together, I'll get even more benefits. And in the real world, that doesn't always happen. So, again, why it's important to, self-experiment and see how we're responding to things.
That's so interesting, because you do often find them put together in some products. Yeah. Now, what?
Yeah, and sometimes animal studies don't translate to human studies, but I would just be cautious about pairing those together and assuming that you get more memory from both, where you might actually get more benefits from just doing one or the other.
Yeah, and exactly. And then it's good to see what's doing what as well. Yeah. So have you heard of Alpinia galanga, a nootropic?
I have. Yep. I've actually used it in a few different products and read the research on it. So yeah, it's galanga is the name. I lived in Thailand at one point before becoming a naturopath, and it would have been an herb I learned about in my Thai classes at the time. Yeah, it would be somewhat, I think of it as the ginger-ish family. It's not technically a zingiber species, but it would be a rhizome like that. And the studies on it would really have shown it almost as like a non-stimulating alertness booster. So like the archetypal alertness booster is caffeine, but it's a stimulant. And what seems to be the case in the studies on Alpinia galanga is it does a lot of the things that you would normally think caffeine would do in these types of cognitive batteries to do with, alertness and focus.
Okay. So you could take one or the other or combine them?
I think two of the studies have done placebo, one, the other, or both combined, and at least acutely. So by like a single dose, there's no advantage in seemingly to combine them.
Okay.
At least over like a single day. I think there was a 28-day study that the combination was a bit additive.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So it can be taken acutely. That's what I'm always looking for, because I'm always in a, I need to take something right now, like just before an exam. I haven't had the forethought to think, I need to start taking this 6 weeks before. So that's one that could be taken acutely and work quite well.
Yes, yeah. And one I think that, at least here in the United States, is still way underappreciated. So,
yeah, it's relatively
and really
new here too.
Many things in that ginger family, have cognitive benefits. Ginger itself does. One of my, so I read a lot of cognitive studies, which it sounds like you do as well. But one of my favorite, it was just regular ginger. I want to say it was Vietnamese women, and it was 8 weeks. And what's quite common in these studies that do cognition, that use these, batteries like the test you just mentioned, and they'll do maybe 16 different tests during it. And quite often, what the compound or herb may do is it really shine maybe in one or two of the 16. And this particular ginger study shined in like 7 or 8 and improved drastically, from baseline to 4 weeks and even more at 8 weeks. So it was one of the more impressive results I've seen was, on ginger, which I for years, I don't know when I started this, but I've called ginger my desert island. If I could only have one thing, and I was marooned on a desert island of all the herbs I know about, it would be ginger.
You can tell that you're a naturopath.
Yeah.
I love ginger too, but I've never heard of it for cognition. We know it's a great digestive, amazing circulatory stimulant. I'm excited to try it for its cognitive benefits. So is it couldn't do that necessarily as a food as medicine though, right? It would have to be higher dose? Yeah,
so this was, I want to say they did 400 and 800 milligrams in the study. The higher dose worked better, and it was standardized for like 9% gingerol and like 1% shogals. Or like there was a very specific standardization that went, but not a ridiculously high one. It's quite common in the U.S. market to find ginger extracts somewhere between 5 and 20%.
Ah, okay. Well, that's on my to-do list to try that out. Amazing. What about Gotu Kola, Centella asiatica, which is one of my favourite? I feel like I say this about every herb, but definitely Gotu Kola is something I use a lot. Not necessarily for its nootropic action, though. Yeah,
so I think of Brahmi, I think is the Ayurvedic word, and Bacopa and Gotu Kola get mixed up a lot in Ayurveda, or the word that's the name for one can be applied to both. So to me, it has a lot of the similar attributes of Bacopa. Like I think of it as a more, like in my lingo, I would say there's, start of the day nootropics, and then there's early evening nootropics, like at dinner time. And the characteristic I would want from the evening ones would be that they're, more calming, more anti-stress, help with long-term memory. And I think Gotu Kola fits perfectly in that. I wouldn't, like if someone was, that more frantic brain, that would also be an indication for me. It's just something to me that sits more on that Bacopa relaxing end of the nootropic spectrum than something that's more alerting.
Yeah, I agree. I often think it of being such a grounding adaptogen. I was reading these really interesting animal studies, which again, doesn't necessarily translate into human, but they showed that Gotu Kola resulted in neurons forming new dendritic trees and branches to create new synapses in the hippocampus. So there were these new connection points sending out signals, which suggests to me it's essentially working on neuroplasticity. And what they saw was that there was increased acetylcholine. So I guess understanding this mechanism, which is something I had no idea, really kind of highlights why Gotu Kola might be useful in improving that working memory.
Yes, yeah. I think, many of the, what I think of as your Ayurvedic memory tonics, when we start to look at them through modern science, neuroplasticity comes up over and over again, and the cholinergic system. I know we're big fans here, like some of the people in my community, of an Ayurvedic seed called Celastris. And I've heard different ways that the plant had been referred to, but one is intellect tree. And the seeds were just consumed. And for some of the same reasons that the other nootropics, things like mental acuity and memory, and Gotu Kola. Like, one of the cool things about Ayurvedic is they had these concepts of, I want to say it's something like Mayarana. Anyway, I'm forgetting the term, but basically mental rejuvenators. And Gotu Kola, Bacopa, they would have been in that category of very prized things for what we would now think of as the brain.
So we've talked a lot about herbs, and we talked about L-theanine. What about nicotinamide riboside, which is a form of vitamin B3 needed for cellular energy and brain function? It's becoming more popular here, but it's not something I actually know that much about. Have you used it, and what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I've used it. I have actually measured my NAD levels in my blood before and after doing it several different times. So so NR is got really big here in the U.S. as well, starting probably about 7 years ago. It started really gaining a lot of momentum. But it's important primarily because it builds NAD, which is a hub molecule that I think of as doing three main things, though this way oversimplifies it. But one, we need NAD to carry electrons to our mitochondria to make ATP. So it's super important for making energy. As something called NADP, which is just made from NAD, it's super important for glutathione, antioxidant defenses, and building molecules. So think of it as like cellular protection or resilience. And then the last thing is the NAD molecule can be what's thought of as consumed to activate enzymes like DNA repair or sirtuins, which are involved in cellular stress responses. So that's where the longevity story starts to tie in. And the way I think it, just in simple sense of NAD, is that when our cells are stressed for whatever reason, NAD becomes a really prized resource. So what you would see is cells, if they have the ability to make more, they'll upregulate that when they get stressed. And the goal of a cell being resilient, at least my thoughts on it, is it's when a cell can adapt resiliently to stress, then it just gets fitter, right? It's like a hormetic stress. But if not, then something will get damaged, or worse, it'll turn into something that's called a senescent cell, or maybe even worse, a cancer cell. And so, I think of NR and other things that help build NAD as really about making it so our cells have more resources so that when they get stressed, they'll be able to handle the stress.
And probably our cells are being stressed on a very regular basis with modern day life, right? With the things that we were talking about in the beginning with that resource depletion.
Oh, for sure. And chronic inflammation or inflammaging, is very common as we get older. And one of the things that happens is that tends to deplete NAD quite a bit. So, what you would commonly see if a lab here in the U.S. that measures NAD in the blood, I've talked with them many times, and what they see is consistent, that someone in their early 20s will have a lot higher levels than I'll have in my early 60s. And if I supplement NR or other precursors, then my levels get into what they think of as the optimal range. But if not, no matter, I feel like I live a pretty healthy lifestyle, get plenty of sleep, exercise. My levels just can't on their own with what I can achieve through diet get to that optimal level. So, NR, I think as we get older, becomes a more interesting thing to consider doing.
That is interesting. I feel like I want to run out and get some now. I was also reading in one study, which I thought was really interesting, that there's a 20 to 30-year interval between the first abnormal changes in brain amyloid biomarkers and then that onset of clinical symptoms with regards to dementia. So it seems like these things, this chronic stress and this damage can be happening a very, very long time before we actually see the symptoms, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the most, I don't know what your experience is like, but when I used to see patients, it wasn't uncommon for someone to say something like, oh, I was completely healthy until X, or, like an X being some diagnosis they had. And it's like, well, probably not.
Yes.
Right? There's probably a lot going on under the hood that, that was making it so you were susceptible. And the analogy I personally use, and this goes back to a game that my siblings and I had when we were kids in the late 60s that I think was called The Last Straw, but we refer to it as the camel game. But it was just this plastic camel. There was a bucket on each side, and then there was different colored straws, plastic straws, that each team would put in their bucket. And so you spun a wheel. If you got the blue, then you put one blue straw in. And at some point, someone would put a straw in, and the plastic back would collapse, like the proverbial last straw. And I tend to think of health a lot like that. It's overly simple, but we all have some degree of resilience, right? We can carry so many straws, and all of our buckets have some in them. Some are shared, right? Like maybe all of us have the 5G straw because of where we live, or UV because of where we live, or something, right? Our circumstances. Or I was in the Navy, sleep deprivation straw at that point. But we can't know 100% how close we are to the last straw. And so the goal is to keep our buckets as free of the straws we can remove as possible, and ideally not worry about the ones we can't control. And so, one of the things that I think when we start to talk about cellular stress, I would have the same analogy. And, the way I would think of NR is it would be something that just makes it maybe that we could carry a few more straws. Yeah,
that's a great analogy. So it seems that nootropics are the perfect solution for replenishing our mental energy pool. And we've talked, when are they indicated clinically in terms of presentation of the patient? So we've talked to students, talked a little bit about dementia, Alzheimer's. Are there any kind of major patient presentations where you'd be thinking, okay, you need to be taking nootropics?
So, really, I think like my simple story is most of us want our brain to be able to do more, and to do more, it needs more resources, right? But like a presentation outside of those ADHD or say cognitive decline with aging that I think is often overlooked is that as a naturopath, when I saw patients and how many of my colleagues do is they ask people to change a lot, lifestyle, diet, you name it, as part of their prescription for that person to become healthier or, to get the results they want. And when we're wanting to change our habits, that requires a lot more brain energy and resources than continuing to do what we're doing. So this would be true, right? If, so I don't play the piano. And if I was to decide, I want to learn the piano, I would play the piano really badly, probably for a long while, but it would take a lot of resources for my brain to play poorly. Where someone that's already good at the piano, part of the reason that got burned into their memory is so it can be really efficient. They could be a virtuoso and require almost no brain energy and resources. So when we're asking a patient to make changes, we're actually demanding a lot more of their brain. So one of the use cases I think that should be more for nootropics is when we're wanting to change, we should be doing nootropics. Well, for the neuroplasticity piece, I mentioned how important choline is in burning things into memory, right? And that dopamine for the motivation. But long story short, I think that's a really important use that's often overlooked.
Yeah, great. So, and all our patients want to make changes, so they would seem like a really good addition. Why do, though, some people not feel the effects of nootropics? Like, what's going on biologically?
I think lots of things, but again, it's that your mileage may vary. And so quite often what it can be, it's just the wrong nootropic for them, or it's the wrong stack or combination of things for them. Sometimes it just takes a while, right, for some things to work versus others, right? Like, if we're sleep deprived and do caffeine or a hydrogen tablet to turn our water into hydrogen water, we'll probably feel that pretty quickly. Most of us will, but some people won't, right? Like, I think an analogy that I use in the research that I do is I group people for any intervention into 4 different pools. So for most interventions, there's going to be a subset of people that are super responders. Whatever that is, whether it's lifting weights or Bacopa, that group of people just gets a surprisingly big response to it. And then there's a subset of people that are good responders. They get kind of what you would expect as a response. And then a subset of people that it just doesn't do much for, like they don't notice anything, or that is an example. That exercise routine just doesn't work particularly well for them. And then there's often a subset of people that are negative responders, right? The same thing that caused a super great response for someone else is counterproductive for them. And so trying to figure out why that is, you can always, some of it's going to be genetic, some of it's going to be maybe sleep deprivation versus well rested. But I think that mental model of there's these 4 groups and, which one did I slot into for this particular thing? Thumbs up, I'm a super responder. Like negative responder, it's maybe not the thing. It's just that thing for you isn't all that. And if someone's like a non-responder to a lot of things, then I, as a naturopath, would go back to basics, right? Let's work on toxicity. Let's make sure stress and sleep, all those things are handled. And then just let's worry about getting those in place. And often as your resiliency builds, you start to respond better to things, or more characteristically, how other people would respond to that thing.
That makes sense, yeah. So are there any safety issues with plant nootropics? Because definitely with some of the more allopathic nootropics, there are kind of side effects. What about the plant aspect?
Yeah, so I think my general bias is that, and I would refer to it as like a Yerkes Dodson law, but just for listeners, picture an upside down U that, and I'll use exercise as an example, but if all of us listening haven't been doing any exercise, almost no matter what we do, our performance will improve. We'll start to climb up the U, like the one side of the U. And then at some point over enough time, we'll probably plateau unless we do something to change up the routine. And if we overdo it, then we start to slide down the other end and overtrain. And so I think most things we can overtrain to, even, like vitamins, for sure, adaptogens. And so the key thing I would just say is more is not always better. And caffeine's a stark example, right? Caffeine, the original Yerkes Dodson research that led to them naming this law was done on caffeine and arousal specifically. And what they found was that, caffeine at one dose had people climb that hill, so to speak. But if they did more than that, performance started to suffer. Because, above that threshold, now you start to see irritability and all the things that as a naturopath we would have called caffeineism start to creep into the picture. So my general belief is that, more of a Goldilocks principle to things, that most things, if we don't take a break from them periodically, like, weight training, or if we do too much or too high, like I think of intensity as something that causes us to go through that U faster. We could probably walk or do yoga class comfortably for the rest of the decade and never run the risk of tracking through that. But if we ran a marathon every weekend, maybe 3 months from now, we'd be breaking down. So in supplements, intensity is dose, the amount that we take. So, if we're taking lower amounts, say like nutritional amounts of vitamin C, we probably won't track through that Yerkes Dodson law in the rest of our life. But if we're taking mega doses of that or something else, then maybe quicker. And so, that's how I start to think about it as my mental model. That I don't assume, I assume everything has a potential downside, but a lot of that's going to be the dose makes the poison, so to speak.
Yeah, and that makes complete sense, especially with nootropics when we're thinking that they're working on brain chemistry, right? So Yeah.
Yeah. And so I know one of the ways that then I coach people to do it is, all right, we're going to do a nootropic, maybe a single herb, maybe a combination of nootropic things together. Like I personally take my stack or my combination of things Monday through Friday and then take the weekends off, just like I would from weight training. And then every, maybe 2 or 3 months, I'll take a week or 2 off to, like with weight training, you would deload, right? You would have a time period built in that you're going to prioritize rest and recovery. And with nootropics, with adaptogens, I think, that would be my recommendation. Someone I'm working with, how I would approach it. If you take a few days off, take a week, it's not like a medication that you might need every day. These things, what we want to do is push the system, but then give it an opportunity to rest and recover so that we can keep getting benefits over time.
What great insights. Really, really useful and really clinically relevant for us. Thank you so much for joining us today, Greg, and for sharing all of your knowledge with us. And thank you for everything you do within our industry, particularly with the research. The textbook of natural medicine was the first textbook I ever bought, and I still have it and still refer to it as such a good book. Yeah,
I was fortunate enough. I had written maybe about a dozen articles at that point that were in a journal called Alternative Medicine Review. And the authors of the textbook of medicine asked if they could use 3 of them. And I think it was their second edition that they first made their way into.
Oh, amazing. And also the Alternative Medicine Review is also a journal that I've referred to lots at, very naturopathic based with the monographs and things like that. So amazing for everyone to check out. So the key points really I've taken away from today are that plant nootropics really seem to be a necessity for anyone wanting to improve cognition, motivation, alertness, memory, clarity, and really they're not just for people wanting to reduce dementia, it's for healthy people too, right?
Yeah, I mean, I know, that's my personal use case, right? I use them to be able to demand more of my brain, not because of any clinical issue. Thanks so much for joining us today, Greg. We've learnt so much from you. Oh, it's my pleasure. Thanks for having me on your podcast. Thank you everyone for listening today. Don't forget that you can find all the show notes, transcripts and other resources from today's episode on the FX Medicine website, fxmedicine.com.au. I'm Lisa Costa-Bir and thanks for joining us. We'll see you next time.
This podcast is intended as healthcare practitioner education only, and it is not a substitute for medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment.
If you enjoyed this episode, please take a moment to give us a rating and review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to FX Medicine, and share us with your family, friends, and colleagues.